Rachel Maddow had never relied on spectacle. Her voice was calm, her cadence deliberate, and her preparation surgical. She had interviewed generals, presidents, dissidents, and whistleblowers without ever raising her tone. Yet as she sat across from Elon Musk under the lights of Studio 3B, she felt something she had not felt in years. Not fear, not anger, but the faint tremor of moral gravity pulling at her spine. The kind of weight that came when something real was about to happen on television. Not ratings, not theater. Something true. Elon Musk looked as he always did. Impassive, pale, eyes resting somewhere between calculation and boredom. He wore no tie, just a black jacket over a black shirt. He leaned back like he was already tired of the room, and maybe of her. Behind him, the graphics department had kept it clean. No ticker, no gimmicks. Just two names on screen. Rachel Maddow and Elon Musk. That was all it said. Rachel opened the segment the way she always did, with a question that was not really a question. Elon Musk, she said, you now own the largest private communications network in human history. Your satellites cover the planet. Your companies shape our transportation, our defense strategy, and our access to information. My first question is very simple. Do you believe the public has the right to hold you accountable? Elon did not answer right away. He blinked slowly, as if weighing not just her question, but whether it deserved a reply. Then he said something that was neither dismissive nor provocative. It was cold, like steel pulled from deep water. No. Rachel nodded, not surprised, but the words still rang across the set like the air had been pulled thin. No, she repeated, not to challenge, but to clarify. Elon adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, then looked at her with the quiet certainty of someone who had not needed public approval in a long time. The public can hold governments accountable, he said. I'm not a government. I'm a person. You don't vote for me. You buy what I build, or you don't. Rachel did not blink. But what you build decides who has internet during a war. It decides who gets a ride to the hospital, who sees which news story, who gets banned from a social platform. These are not consumer choices anymore. These are structural realities. Elon nodded once, then shrugged. I didn't take that power. People gave it to me. That's not my fault. Rachel had heard deflection before. She had heard spin, and she had heard arrogance. But there was something different in this room tonight. Elon Musk was not trying to be liked, or feared, or admired. He was telling the truth as he saw it. And Rachel knew that if she kept the conversation at the level of facts, she would lose. Because Elon Musk had already detached himself from the language of accountability. He lived above it, or at least outside it. So Rachel changed her approach. She reached for something quieter, something human. Elon, she said, and this time she used his first name not for warmth, but for precision. Do you ever think about how it ends? He looked at her without responding, and for a moment, Rachel thought he might ignore the question. But then he leaned forward slightly, and for the first time, he seemed interested. How it ends, he asked. All of this, she said. Your legacy. The people you silence. The ones you help. The ones you don't. The decisions no one can question because they were made by one man in a private company. Do you think there's a point where it breaks? Where someone says no more? Elon's expression didn't change, but his silence deepened. He didn't fidget. He didn't breathe louder. He simply stared, as if recalculating the conversation from scratch. Then he said, in a voice that felt like it had no temperature at all, people don't say no to what works. They adapt. They complain, but they adapt. That's how civilization works. Rachel sat with that answer. Not because she didn't have a rebuttal. She had pages of them. But because the weight of his words had landed somewhere different. Somewhere deeper. This was not about policy anymore. This was about belief. And quietly, she realized what this segment was about. It was not about proving Elon Musk wrong. It was about understanding how a person convinced themselves that being right was enough. Rachel Maddow let the silence stretch, even though producers in the control room were likely panicking. Dead air was poison in live television. But tonight, it served a purpose. Because Rachel wanted viewers to feel the stillness that had just passed between them. Not tension, not drama, just the quiet realization that they were listening to someone who truly believed in his own inevitability. When Rachel finally spoke, Her voice was steady. Not soft, not sharp, just honest. People adapt, she repeated. And what happens to the people who can't? Elon's eyes didn't move. He had grown very still, not guarded, but locked in place, as if he'd found the shape of the moment and was waiting to see what Rachel would do with it. Rachel continued. There was a man in Iowa, she said. His name was Daniel Reyes. He ran a hardware store that had been in his family for 3 generations. He did everything online. Orders, inventory, payments. During the blackout last year, he lost connection for 6 days. No warning. No explanation. Just gone. He called every number he could find, sent emails, begged for a response. It never came. He couldn't process orders. He lost every perishable item in his storage unit. The bank closed his business line of credit. He had to sell the shop. His son was supposed to inherit it. Elon blinked, then exhaled once, slow and nasal, like a man trying not to show frustration. I don't make decisions case by case, he said. It's not personal. It's infrastructure. Rachel nodded. She expected that answer. She had written it down before the segment began. I know it's not personal, she said. That's the point. Elon shifted in his seat. Rachel didn't press. She let that sit a moment longer, then reached for something she hadn't planned to say. I've covered wars, she said. I've been to villages where the only connection to the outside world is a single satellite terminal bolted to the roof of a clinic. I've met nurses who check to see if the signal is still up before they check if the patient is breathing. And when your company shuts off that signal because of a policy, or a contract, or a geopolitical interest, that nurse is left holding a child and wondering if she's watching them die in silence. Elon looked at her like she was describing a different planet, not because he didn't believe her, but because he had already accepted that consequences were just part of the system. Collateral, like rust on steel. It's not my job to fix the world, he said. Rachel looked straight at him. But you've built machines that decide who gets to try. For the first time, something flickered behind Elon's expression. Not emotion, but maybe discomfort. A fleeting recognition that her words had shape, that they were not rhetorical, that they were weighted with names he had never heard and would never meet. He didn't reply. Rachel waited. Then she said, more gently than she expected, do you ever wonder what it would feel like to be small again? Elon tilted his head, not mocking, but genuinely curious. To not be the decider, Rachel said. To not be the one people plead with. Just one human being, waiting for the internet to come back, so you can send a message to your son that you're still alive. Elon's voice was quiet when it came. No, he said. I don't wonder about that. And Rachel believed him. Not because he lacked empathy, but because he had moved beyond the need to imagine what it meant to have none of the levers. And that was what chilled her most. He had become a man with power so absolute that he no longer felt it. He simply exercised it. Rachel Maddow glanced briefly at the small red light above the center camera. It was still on. The segment had already run long, but no one in the control booth had cut away. Not yet. There was something in the air that even the producers didn't want to interrupt. It was not drama. It was reckoning. Elon Musk sat still, his elbows resting lightly on the armrests. His fingers didn't move. His breathing was shallow. It was the posture of a man who had learned long ago that stillness projected control. Rachel returned to the center of the conversation, where something unspoken still hovered. You say it's not your job to fix the world, she said, but you intervene all the time. You make judgment calls in war zones. You decide which governments get access to your networks. You change content policies on platforms with hundreds of millions of users. So how do you choose? Elon finally moved. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table between them. His eyes never broke from hers. I choose based on what I think works, he said. Not what sounds fair. Not what sounds good. What functions? Rachel let that answer sink in. It was an answer built like a wall. Not hostile. Not evasive. Just immovable. So, she said, functionality is your moral compass. Elon didn't flinch. Correct. Rachel had interviewed people who lied. She had interviewed people who blurred lines. But Elon Musk was different. He was not hiding behind anything. He believed the map in his mind was the territory of the world. That efficiency and survival were the only measurements that mattered. and that frightened her more than deception ever could. She closed the folder of notes on her lap. Not for show. She simply didn't need them anymore. Elon, she said, when you were a child, you were bullied. You've said so in interviews. You've said you used to hide in books and think about the future. A better future. You once told a reporter you wanted to build things that would protect the weak. For a moment, something passed across Elon's face. Not pain, not nostalgia, just a quiet flicker of recognition, like a door briefly opened down a long hallway. Rachel continued. So what changed? What happened between that boy and this man? Elon didn't speak. His eyes shifted slightly, as if measuring the edge of something invisible. Then he said, I realized protection doesn't scale. Rachel waited, not because she didn't understand, but because she wanted to hear it said aloud. Elon continued, you can't design for weakness. You can't build for fragility. You have to build systems that survive. If someone is too slow, too unstable, too uncertain, the system breaks. So you build for strength, for resilience. And if that means some people get left behind, that's unfortunate. But it's necessary. There it was, spoken with the quiet calm of someone who had made peace with consequences that would haunt other people. Rachel folded her hands. Do you hear yourself? She asked. You're talking about human beings like variables, as if empathy is a flaw. Elon didn't blink. Empathy can't guide engineering. If it did, rockets would never leave the ground. Rachel looked at him, and in that moment, she understood something she hadn't understood before. Elon Musk didn't hate people. He didn't want anyone to suffer. But he had reached a place where people no longer registered as real unless they fit into a system he could measure. He had traded compassion for control. And the most terrifying part was that he didn't even see it as a trade. He saw it as progress. In the control room, a producer reached toward the button that would trigger a scheduled commercial break. Then he paused. His hand hovered, waiting for something unspoken. Because even through the cold glow of monitors, everyone could feel that this interview had slipped beyond its original frame. It was no longer about sound bites. It was no longer about headlines. It was about one man's belief in machinery and another's quiet refusal to treat people as data points. Rachel Maddow didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She just kept her voice steady. I understand that systems need to function, she said. But you're not just building systems, Elon. You're shaping realities. You're deciding who gets to speak and who doesn't, who gets to connect and who disappears. You say you design for resilience. But what happens when the world you build becomes unlivable for the people who are not optimized enough to survive it? Elon leaned back, not in defiance, but in quiet resignation. They will adapt, he said again. Rachel shook her head, once, slowly. Some people can't. That's not weakness. That's life. That's grief, disability, poverty, children, people who don't fit into your algorithms, people who are already drowning in systems they never designed. Elon said nothing. His silence wasn't defensive. It was simply a pause between calculations, as if weighing the marginal utility of compassion against the efficiency of indifference. Rachel leaned forward. Her voice was still low, still clear. You've spent your life solving problems most of us will never understand. You've put cars in space. You've built reusable rockets. You've redefined private enterprise on a planetary scale. But this, she tapped her fingers once on the table. This isn't about genius. This is about responsibility. Because when you become the platform, the signal, the infrastructure, the silence that follows a shutdown doesn't just sound like absence. It sounds like a choice. Elon's mouth moved slightly, but no sound came. For the first time, he seemed unsure. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because the answer wouldn't matter. Rachel's words had landed somewhere beyond logic, beyond debate. They had touched something no system could optimize. Elon finally spoke. His voice was quiet. Slower now. You want me to feel guilty. Rachel didn't hesitate. No, she said. I want you to remember. Elon's face stayed still, but the room felt different. Like air pressing down just a little heavier. Like a door opening into a place where control didn't reach. Rachel went on. Somewhere in your life, there was a moment when you believed that building things could help people. Not the strongest people. Not the fastest. Just people. Ordinary, Scared, struggling people. The kind of people who don't get written into biographies unless they die in disasters you were supposed to prevent. Stillness settled again. This time, Elon didn't interrupt it. He let it sit, let it stretch. His eyes lowered, not in shame, but in thought. And Rachel watched him closely. Because she wasn't trying to defeat him. She was trying to find the part of him that still remembered why he started building in the first place. The room had grown unnaturally quiet. The crew stopped whispering. The click of a pen or the shuffle of a camera cable would have sounded like thunder. But no one moved. No one wanted to break what was happening. Because somehow, without raising her voice or making any demands, Rachel Maddow had reached a part of Elon Musk that no interview ever had. Not by pressing, not by provoking, but by asking him to remember who he used to be. Elon looked down at his hands. For a few seconds, he rubbed his thumb across the knuckle of his left finger, slow and mechanical, as if wiping away something that wasn't there. Then he looked back up. When I was 13, he said, I built a small transmitter out of scrap parts. Nothing big. It could barely push a signal 100 yards. But I remember the first time I got it working. I sent a tone out, and it echoed back from the other end. Just a tiny ping. But I remember thinking, someone could hear me. Rachel stayed quiet. Elon's voice was softer now. Still flat, still analytical, but without armor. I used to think the world was noise, he continued. Too loud. Too cruel. And if I could just build a better signal, maybe someone like me wouldn't feel alone. Rachel nodded once. That's still true. Elon hesitated. But now I'm the noise, he said. He didn't say it with regret. Just recognition. Rachel didn't comfort him. She didn't reassure or pivot or reframe. She let the weight of that admission breathe. Elon, she said, when people are scared, they don't need brilliance. They need presence. They need to know someone is still listening. Elon looked past her, toward the empty wall behind the cameras. Listening, he repeated. Rachel watched his face. Not for signs of guilt, but for signs of return. A recalibration, maybe. Something that resembled the boy who once sat alone with wires and batteries and a hope that connection might save him. Most people don't want to change the world, Rachel said. They just want to survive it. And when the tools they depend on are controlled by someone they can't reach, the silence becomes unbearable. You may not have meant to become that silence, Elon. But you are. Elon's jaw clenched once, then released. I never wanted this kind of attention, he said. Rachel believed him. But she also knew it didn't matter. You have it, she said. So what will you do with it? He didn't answer. And for the first time all night, Rachel Maddow ended a question without expecting a reply. Because sometimes the point of a confrontation is not to win, but to plant a question in a place where denial can no longer hold it back. And Elon Musk, the most powerful private individual on Earth, had just been asked one he could not engineer his way around. Somewhere outside the studio, thousands of viewers had already begun sharing clips. Hashtags had started to form. Commentators were scribbling notes for morning segments. But inside the room, none of that mattered. Because in this moment, there were no headlines. No spin. Just one man sitting inside a machine he had built, unsure of how to climb down without breaking it. Elon Musk leaned back in his chair again. This time slower. More deliberate. As if creating space between himself and whatever part of the conversation had gotten too close. I build because it's the only thing that makes sense, he said. The world doesn't reward stillness. It doesn't reward waiting. If I slow down, everything I've made starts to slip. Rachel watched him carefully. So you keep moving, even if the direction stops making sense. Elon nodded once. Yes. There was no pride in it. Just the clarity of someone who had long since stopped asking why. Rachel looked at the camera for the first time in minutes. Then she turned back to Elon. I don't think you're a villain, she said. I think you're scared that if you stop building, the silence will come back. The silence you felt when you were 13, listening to static, hoping someone was out there. Elon's eyes flicked toward her. He didn't argue. Rachel continued. But here's the truth. You're not alone anymore. You haven't been alone in a long time. You are surrounded by people. Engineers. Investors, governments, nations, and millions of strangers who rely on what you build to speak, to learn, to live. She paused. letting the weight of those words sit. And that means you don't get to disappear into function. You don't get to escape into abstraction. Not anymore. Elon swallowed. It was barely visible. But Rachel saw it. Because the line between presence and detachment was thinner than most people realized. And for someone like Elon, it was the only line that mattered. You said earlier that people gave you this power, Rachel said. That it wasn't your fault. But you accepted it. You expanded it. And now, whether you want it or not, you're responsible for the shape of the silence that follows your choices. Elon didn't respond. But his stillness had changed. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't guarded. It was quiet. And maybe, for the first time, reflective. Rachel folded her hands again, this time with less tension. I can't tell you how to use your power, she said. But I can ask you to remember what it felt like to need someone and have no one answer. Elon stared at the table. Rachel looked toward the control booth. A voice clicked in her earpiece. Wrap soon. She turned back to him one last time. This conversation might not change your next decision, she said. But I hope, somewhere down the line, when you're alone with a satellite map or a server log or a kill switch on a data stream, you remember this moment. Not because of me, but because it reminded you that even the strongest systems are made of people. Elon looked up. His voice was barely audible. I remember. For a moment, Rachel Maddow didn't speak. Not because she was finished, but because she wanted to leave space for what Elon Musk had just said. 3 words. I remember. Spoken not with sentiment, not with apology, but with something rarer, acknowledgement. And that was enough. For now. The studio lights hummed quietly overhead. Elon's posture remained controlled, but something behind his eyes had shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened. Just enough for Rachel to see that the fortress was not empty inside. Just quiet. Just deeply, profoundly quiet. She sat back in her chair and let her hands rest flat against the arms. Her voice returned to its normal cadence, steady and clear. I think this is where we'll leave it tonight, she said. Elon gave a small nod, almost mechanical. But Rachel wasn't finished. Not quite. She turned slightly in her seat, not to the camera, but toward the idea of the people watching. The ones who didn't have power. The ones who had been watching closely for something that felt like truth. We live in a time, she said, when the boundary between private control and public life has grown so thin, it sometimes disappears. When one person's decision about a cable, a connection, a switch, can change lives in ways no vote ever could. And when that happens, we are no longer just citizens. We are participants in systems we never asked to join. Her voice remained calm, but something deeper pulsed beneath the words. A quiet urgency. Not dramatic. Not rhetorical. Just real. Power doesn't always arrive with a uniform or a title. Sometimes it arrives quietly, behind a login screen or a terms of service update. Sometimes it looks like progress. Sometimes it looks like indifference. But every time it affects how we live, we have the right to question it. We have the right to ask who gets to decide. She turned back to Elon. And we have the right to ask that person to see us. Elon didn't move, but he was listening. Rachel leaned forward one last time. Her tone was softer now. I don't need you to be a savior, she said. I just need you to be human, especially when it's easiest not to be. Elon didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. Rachel looked to the camera, not with a sign-off smile, but with the same expression she had worn throughout. Clear, focused, steady. We'll be back after the break. The red light above the camera clicked off. The segment was over, but no one in the studio moved. No one said a word. Because when something real happens on live television, the air doesn't just change. It settles, like dust after an earthquake. And in that silence, somewhere behind the machinery of algorithms and market shares and orbital bandwidth, a man who once built machines to be heard had, at last, been asked to listen. The commercial break came and went, but the room didn't reset. The crew moved more slowly than usual, as if instinctively respecting the gravity that still hung in the air. A production assistant offered Elon Musk a bottle of water. He took it, nodded once, and set it on the table unopened. Rachel Maddow remained in her seat, arms crossed loosely, not speaking. She wasn't trying to linger. She simply wasn't ready to walk away from something that didn't feel finished. Eventually, Elon turned to her. No cameras rolling, no microphones live. "You think I'm lost," he said. Rachel took a breath. "No, I think you're further from people than you realize." Elon looked at the floor for a moment, then up again. "Every time I try to engage with people, it gets twisted. Either I'm a tyrant or I'm weak. Either I don't care or I care for the wrong reasons. At some point, it just makes more sense to focus on the machines. At least they behave predictably." Rachel nodded slowly. "Machines don't need you to understand them. People do." Elon leaned back in his chair again, the fatigue now visible in the weight of his shoulders. He didn't look defeated. He looked like someone quietly wondering if the architecture of his entire worldview had a flaw he hadn't accounted for. Rachel's tone softened, but she remained firm. "I don't need you to be consistent," she said. "I need you to be honest about your influence. If you're going to hold the levers, you have to recognize who's underneath them." Elon was quiet for a long time. Then he said something Rachel had not expected to hear. "I had a brother once," he said. "Not blood, but close. We used to dream about building cities on Mars. When things got hard, he always said the same thing. Don't forget why you started. He died 3 years ago. Brain cancer. No one ever wrote about him. But he's the reason I kept going after the first failures. The reason I still push so hard." Rachel listened. Not as a journalist, just as a person. Elon's voice didn't shake, but the air around him changed. "I haven't thought about him in a while," he said. Rachel nodded. "Maybe it's time you did." There was no moral punchline, no emotional climax. Just two people sitting in a studio, after the lights had dimmed, having a conversation that mattered more than either of them had planned. Elon finally reached for the bottle of water and took a sip. Rachel stood, slowly. Elon did too. He extended a hand. She shook it. And then, as he turned to leave, he paused. "If I do something different," he said, "it won't be because of public pressure. It'll be because of this." Rachel didn't ask what this meant. She didn't need to. Sometimes change doesn't come from outrage or exposure. Sometimes it comes from being seen by someone who asks nothing in return but truth. The next morning, newsrooms were already dissecting the interview. Some headlines praised Rachel Maddow's poise. Others criticized Elon Musk's detachment. Clips were cut and shared out of context. Reaction videos surfaced within hours. But what most of them missed was the stillness. The deep, unspoken moment when something shifted, not in what was said, but in what was finally felt. Elon Musk did not issue a statement. He didn't post online. He didn't try to reframe the moment or explain it away. He simply went quiet. And for someone who had always filled silence with progress, with disruption, with noise, this silence was different. Rachel returned to her usual rhythm. She prepped the next show. She researched congressional briefings, wrote intros, revised scripts. But something had stayed with her. Not the confrontation, not the tension, just one sentence, spoken almost like an afterthought. "I remember." She thought about that sentence while walking home that night. The sidewalks were wet from a spring rain. Her shoes scuffed quietly on the pavement. A kid biked past with a backpack half-zipped. A man at a newsstand argued gently with someone about baseball stats. The world went on, indifferent but familiar. It reminded her that even the most powerful conversations eventually fade back into the ordinary. And that was the point. Change doesn't announce itself. It begins in silence. The next time Elon Musk appeared in public, it wasn't at a tech summit or on a financial panel. It was at a rural hospital in northern Arizona. No press, no cameras, just a satellite terminal, a team of engineers, and a nurse who had once written 12 unanswered emails during a blackout. The nurse didn't know why the new equipment had arrived. She didn't know who paid for it or who had fast-tracked the installation. But when she turned it on and the green light flickered to life, she smiled. Not because the signal was strong, but because for once, it had arrived without her having to beg. Elon stood at the edge of the clinic's courtyard. He didn't introduce himself. He watched the installation in silence. A child waved at him from a window. He waved back, awkwardly. Then he turned and walked to his car. The hospital director would later say he had never seen a man so powerful look so unsure of where to put his hands. And maybe that was the beginning of something. Not a rebrand, not a redemption, but a return to something quiet, to something true, to the first sound a transmitter makes when someone finally answers the signal. Weeks passed. The interview faded from the news cycle. Other stories took its place. Elections, trials, storms, crises. The world moved forward, as it always does, without asking who might have changed while no one was looking. Rachel Maddow didn't revisit the segment on her show. She didn't offer commentary or victory laps, because she hadn't gone into that conversation to win. She had gone in to ask a question. And when she left that night, she knew the question had landed somewhere it was meant to be. One evening, a letter arrived at her office. Not an email, not a statement. A letter, handwritten, in clean, blocky print. It said, "When I was 12, I built a circuit that failed because I tried to protect every component. I didn't understand that a good design doesn't make everything safe. It makes failure survivable. You reminded me of that. Thank you." There was no signature, but Rachel knew who had written it. She folded the letter once and placed it inside a book on her desk, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful shifts happen off camera, in the quiet, after the segment ends, when no one is watching. Somewhere in a server room outside Austin, engineers began rolling out a policy that required human review before cutting access to high-dependency regions. It wasn't a complete change, just a safeguard, just a human hand on a lever that used to be automatic. Somewhere else, an internal memo instructed that content moderation decisions now required written justification for any permanent suspension. Not because the company had grown more compassionate, but because someone had asked what silence meant. Rachel didn't take credit. She didn't mention it on air. She just kept doing the work. Interview after interview. Story after story. Because she understood something Elon was still learning. That change isn't always an invention. Sometimes it's a return. To conscience. To clarity. To the feeling of being 13, alone in a room, sending out a signal just to know someone is there. And years later, to hearing a voice quietly say, through all the noise, through all the power, "I remember."